All right, so I'm going live to talk about the witness statements that the government released yesterday in in relation to the China spy case. Right, so the Keir Starmer belatedly agreed to release these statements after saying for a week and a half that it that the government could not because the CPS, the Crown Prosecution Service, objected. And then the Tuesday, the Crown Prosecution Service confirmed that it had never objected, and in fact, the the it was up to the government whether to produce its own evidence or not, which makes sense. So I stacked this morning on eight revelations from these three witness statements that were released yesterday. And as I said in the stack, I gave some teasers in the Substack. I said broadly these revelations prove several of Starmer's claims about the dropped spy case, the collapsed spy case, whatever you want to call it. Most of his claims, in fact, are false. The witness statements disprove him on some claims that I'd already reported were incredible anyway. We'll get into those. And then I said that what is more surprising to me is that the witness statements contain evidence that the government has been putting trade before security for a long time. Now, I've reported other evidence, particularly on the Huawei case, going back several years. But what we've got is evidence from the witness statements that China was interested in whether the British government was planning to sanction China economically. And in fact, this was under the Boris Johnson administration, so this was back in early 2022. One of the witness statements in the government's attempt to testify to the prosecutors' evidence being sufficient to prove that the espionage by the two alleged Britons, the alleged espionage, I should say, by these two Britons, was sufficient to pass this standard for harm essentially to Britain's interests. And one of the paragraphs that Matthew Collins, the Deputy National Security Advisor, chose to highlight as evidence towards this threshold was that China was asking for information from these alleged spies about Boris Johnson's seriousness about sanctioning Xinjiang for the use of Uyghurs there as slave labor. And that Collins was not intent on revealing that the government was putting trade before security. He was just trying to illustrate that this sort of intelligence was harming British interests because China could use this intelligence to inform its own policymaking. It had insight into a hidden policy, right? So but this is where it reveals that the government was putting trade before security. The Boris Johnson administration, as reported by the alleged spies to China's agents, was the Boris Johnson administration was publicly saying it was considering sanctioning imports from that province, and yet the information passed to China's agents was that it had no intent of doing so, despite these public statements. So that is an example of how the witness statements have confirmed this pattern going back to Tony Blair's administration. So now we're going back almost 30 years. Successive administrations, even Boris Johnson, who was probably considered the most hawkish on China of premiers since Tony Blair, Liz Truss might be considered more hawkish, but she only lasted a few weeks. So the witness statements unwittingly confirm this bias towards trade over security, which is at the heart of the scandal over the why this case dropped against these two alleged British spies for China. Why did the case drop? The allegation from the anonymous sources, or whistleblowers as they may become, is that the Keir Starmer administration was worried that prosecuting the case would provoke China to cut investment. He's looking for an economic reset, which will include his first official visit to China next year, 2026. And he wants an economic reset, and he wants to be able to go to Beijing in 2026 with a pre-agreed deal for investment. I mean, these deals are often illusory. They're really more about show than substance. Their promises, their estimates of the billions that will benefit the British economy never pan out. But he wants that optics, right? So the allegation from the anonymous sources more than a week ago, so now we're talking almost 2 weeks ago, the allegation was that the motivation from the Starmer administration was to scupper this case against the two Britons in order to reset economic relations with China. So they were putting trade before security. I reported this at the time. It was actually Monday after the anonymous sources were reported on the Sunday. I straight away reported this as the government putting trade before security, if the anonymous sources are correct in their evidence. Okay, so let's put that to bed. That there is more evidence that the government has consistently, over a period of almost 30 years, put trade before security, and that includes even the Boris Johnson administration. So that's one of the things we learned from the witness statements. That surprised me most. I think Collins was indiscreet, or he had an axe to grind against Boris Johnson, under whom he served, by the way, in a different capacity as a civil servant. So maybe it was deliberate. All right, so there's three things I put out there as teasers. So Starmer's claims are false. That was number one. His predecessors in the premiership also put trade before security. That was number two. And spying is worse than reported. Right, so I kind of got distracted on that second one. Predecessors also put trade before security, because that was so fundamental to why this scandal broke in the first place that I chose to focus on that one. I realize I haven't given you any teasers about any further information on the teaser about Starmer's claims are false, and I'll get to that. The third one was spying is worse than reported. All right, so let's get to Starmer's claims are false, according to the witness statements. And his claims, as I mentioned, are really bizarre. I've already reported on this. His claims were incredible to begin with, right? So the first thing is just a simple point. The witness statements, all of them are classified open. Collins's witness statements, they're classified open, and specifically the first witness statement says there's nothing in here that he has deliberately left his analysis less detailed than would be the case if he had drafted it at a secret or higher classification, which is fair because the witness statement will be entered into a public hearing of a criminal case. Now, by the way, it is possible for the prosecution service to ask for a secret testimony in a case with national security implications. That's actually another issue that might come back to haunt the Crown Prosecution Service, being the agency that decided to drop the case. irrespective of whether there was government pressure for CPS to do that, the CPS could be accused of failing to prosecute the case effectively if it did not make provision for secret classified testimony, right? So in other words, the prosecutors could present more effective evidence if it was classified secret. And routinely British courts in these cases have allowed for witnesses to hide their identities and for secret content and above to be redacted from the judge's ruling, or to be reviewed by the intelligence and security services before the court releases the final ruling. Okay, so this is why it matters. So the first witness statement is classified open. All of the witness statements are classified open. This is why it matters. The government, Starmer's administration specifically, Starmer himself personally and his security minister, Dan Jarvis, both claimed that they could not release the witness statements because the Crown Prosecution Service had objected. The Crown Prosecution denies that and rightly says the government could release whatever it produces. And then you had this sort of pantomime on Wednesday where Starmer told the Commons, oh, now I can release them because the CPS has effectively withdrawn its objection, an objection which the CPS says it never lodged in the first place. And then it gets more bizarre because he says, now I can release them, but we still need to review them for sensitivity. No, that doesn't make any sense because you just, you've released these documents, or Matthew Collins released these documents to the prosecution service saying they're open. In other words, they're not sensitive. They might be sensitive in the sense that before trial you don't want to release them because the defense then you're prejudicing the public's perception of the case, right? You're prejudicing the case, particularly if you're using a jury. You don't want to release the prosecution's evidence into the public domain before the trial, but the trial has already been cancelled. So that issue doesn't apply. The witness statements are not sensitive, therefore they can be released as soon as the trial is cancelled by the prosecutors, and they don't need to be reviewed for sensitivity, right? So again, Starmer's claims prove to be false, and he looks like a liar. Let me get to some other issues where Starmer looks to be dishonest. The witness statements disprove his claim that the prosecutors could not declare China a threat. He said this over again. I've stacked 3 times now saying he is wrong to say this. Just to remind you the details, Starmer initially blamed the collapse, and he repeated himself. It wasn't a slip of the tongue or anything. He blamed the collapse of the case on the previous administrations, that's Rishi Sunak's administration's reassessment of China as an epoch-defining challenge. And he said that the CPS needs to prove that China is a threat at the time the accused were allegedly spying in order to reach the threshold for spying as defined in the Official Secrets Act. We'll get to the Official Secrets Act in a moment. Dan Jarvis, Security Minister, said the same thing. Even when Starmer told the Commons on Wednesday he would release the statements, he claimed that they would prove that Rishi Sunak's administration is to blame for the prosecutor's inability to prove China is a threat. However, the witness statements repeatedly describe China as a threat. In any case, you don't need to prove China's threat. I've already reported on this. The Official Secrets Act does not use the word threat ever. And it is quite clear that all the prosecution needs to prove is that the 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 purpose that the spy's purpose, they passed in information to an actor with a purpose prejudicial to the safety or interests of the state, and that can be as simple as you are passing secrets to a party who uh, should not be entitled to view those secrets. If you know that if you know that that other party could use those secrets prejudicially to the safety or interests of Britain, you are guilty of that crime, according to the Official Secrets Act. So I am astounded that Starmer keeps claiming that prosecutors need to breach that threshold. They need to prove it's a threat, that China is a threat, in order to prosecute two Britons who allegedly passed information to China's intelligence agents. It doesn't make any sense, right? It is, and the witness statements disprove him. They disprove him again, on top of the other evidence that makes no sense. The other evidence, by the way, is I've stacked before, just to remind you, is that in fact, Rishi Sunak's administration did refer to China as a threat, just not in the particular document that Starmer picks on, where China is described as a challenge, which incidentally, Starmer's administration has also, is the word that the Starmer's administration has also chosen to use to describe China. So it's so hypocritical, and his claim that he cannot, or prosecutors cannot prove threat, is false. In the period that the alleged spying happened, 2021 to 2023, three administrations, Boris Johnson's, Liz Truss, Rishi Sunak, described China as a threat. All right, so let's just put that to bed. The witness statements, this is where the witness statements come in, repeatedly describe China as a threat. Um, and as I said, the Crown Prosecution Service never needed to prove China is a threat or officially coded as a threat. Anyway, it just needs to prove that the defendants acted prejudicial to the safety and interests of the United Kingdom. And let's get on to that. Collins did testify that the defendants acted prejudicial to the safety and interests of the United Kingdom. He had already testified to that standard in the trial of six Romanians accused of spying for Russia, a trial that concluded in May with his testimony to that standard. And his witness statements for this trial of two Britons accused of spying for China, which was supposed to go to trial this month in October, he testified to the same thing in all three witness statements, going back to 2023. So Starmer's claim doesn't look true, but it's not true. It's not true. And it also looks dishonest, right? So it's definitely not true. It also looks dishonest. So other things that Starmer doesn't look honest on, I'm going to say, I'm still trying to deal with teasers. The the Starmer administration's posture that China is or was not a threat and is not a threat. I think this is where I can phrase it as most scandalous. The Starmer administration just in August concluded its integrated review of defense and security, concluding that China is a challenge, not a threat. Right, so he's a hypocrite because he's blaming Rishi Sunak for coding Rishi Sunak's administration's integrated defense security review. He's blaming its conclusion that China is a challenge for the collapse of this case. So he's at least a hypocrite. But this is where it matters to current trade. Um, you remember the anonymous sources claim that when the Starmer administration, actually the National Security Council, reporting to Keir Starmer himself, met in August to review this case secretly. It referred back to Starmer's Integrated Defense Security Review and the coding of China as a challenge, and said we cannot prosecute this case. Denials all around, right? Remember, you're probably realizing this. Remember that that claim, if that were true, if Starmer's National Security Council used the administration's own coding of China as a challenge in August 2025 to justify withdrawing its testimony as to China's threat, then that contradicts Starmer's claim that the prosecutors dropped the case because of a code of challenge in 2023. And it contradicts his claim that the prosecution can only prosecute crimes that were committed in a period where the government officially coded China as a threat, which, by the way, is a period when the government, including its prime ministers, did speak of China as a threat. I know there are so many falsities in what Starmer has said about this case. All right, so what I wanted to get to was China's espionage is much worse, according to these witness statements, than the government has admitted. And this is where it gets to the final of my three teasers, that the government is putting trade before security. I said there is evidence in the witness statements that Boris Johnson's administration did so. There's also evidence that China is very interested in, for a long period of time, in Britain's policy towards trade. And any claim by the Starmer administration that China is a challenge, it's not a threat. And remember, it's the administration's own integrated review has declared China a challenge. It doesn't square with the evidence in these witness statements, because the witness statement, Matthew Collins, in these statements highlights various evidence which he is effectively using as evidence towards a coding of China as a threat. For instance, we know from the witness statements, or we know from the allegations highlighted in the witness statements, let me be careful with my legal phrasing here, that Christopher Berry, one of the accused, the other is Chris Cash. Christopher Berry was tasked by a handler in China, communicating through cyberspace to obtain information on British policies related to China. The leadership contenders for the Conservative Party in 2022 and government appointments, members of parliament who might be appointed to government with influence on policy towards China, including Tom Tugendhat, who became security minister in October 2022. And he was one of the founders of the China Research Group, which is a hawkish uh, group of members of parliament. He was one of the founders of that. So that China allegedly was gathering information through Christopher Berry and Christopher Cash, who worked by that time, as director of the China Research Group, not a member of parliament, but directing the China Research Group. He was a researcher himself and then directed the China Research Group and had the most privileged insight into that group other than a member of parliament. So both of them were reporting, allegedly, on what members thought about China, what they planned to vote on of relevance to China, even the identities of Taiwanese officials meeting with them in Britain, and other committees, parliamentary committees, plans to visit Taiwan, when they would do it, at least, and presumably who they would be meeting with and who would be traveling and what their agenda would be. Because those committees, the Foreign Affairs Committee, included members of the China Research Group, including at one time being chaired by Tom Tugendhat. So this speaks to a penetration of Parliament beyond cyberspace, which we're also learning about from leaks, from anonymous sources, that China has penetrated government communications in cyberspace. Communications between the key departments, including the Prime Minister's office, including the Ministry of Defense, and including SO15, the Metropolitan Police Agency that investigates and counters intelligence. But this is the allegations against Cash and Berry are special because it involves human intelligence, right? Rather, those other cases, China is intercepting digital telecommunications. In this case, Cash and Berry are allegedly communicating with, at least Berry is communicating with a handler through to telecommunications. At one time, he, according to the witness statements, visits China, actually visits Beijing, to meet with the leading party representative, Chinese Communist Party representative, over that city. Somebody had previously served on the China's equivalent to the National Security Council. So Berry is traveling, allegedly, to China to pass information. And the intercepted telecommunications between Cash and Berry that Collins highlights is damning for their awareness of is damning evidence for their awareness that they were aware that the information they were passing was sensitive. Such as for Cash to say in telecommunications through an encrypted app, when Cash heard that Berry was in Beijing, Cash said, "You're in spy territory now." And Cash often says to Berry in these telecommunications, "You didn't hear it from me," or words to that effect. So they were mindful of the sensitivity of the information that they were transmitting. So China, this is why it matters. This is human intelligence. This is human to human contact. In the case of Berry visiting the top CCP person in Beijing, that's human to human. Who knows what was discussed verbally? That sort of transmission, that verbal transmission of intelligence, is very difficult for counterintelligence officers to intercept unless they bug the room or they have a witness, an informer who is witness to it, and that's very tricky to do in China itself. And then there is human to human intelligence inside Parliament in the form of the alleged overhearing what members of Parliament are discussing or reading their privileged and also protected telecommunications, right? Because committees in Parliament are committee members, members of Parliament in general, are communicating routinely by apps on their phone. They have discussion groups on WhatsApp or whatever, and they are emailing each other through the parliamentary system, which was supposedly hacked, according to anonymous sources. Anyway, the human sources inside Parliament, particularly Chris Cash, allegedly would have more insight into members of Parliament, at least in the China Research Group, because he's overhearing them in person. He's not just reading their emails, at least if the business is relevant to the China Research Group. He is overhearing them, so he has more insight. This is human intelligence. It's more valuable than usually than the telecommunications that you intercept, because it can confirm things which are suspected from the telecommunications, but the targets are not prepared to put into telecommunications in rare instances. So China's penetration of Parliament is much worse than we thought, given what we see in these witness statements. So stay tuned.